she never took it off. Her mother said that. The Apple Watch was on Lynette Hooker's wrist every day. The kind of device you forget is even there because it's been there so long. And when Bahamian authorities confirmed it had been found, not her body, her watch. The significance of that single detail is something that most coverage has not stopped to fully explain. Because what was found was not jewelry. What was found was a continuous biological record of Lynette Hooker's last known living moments, her heart rate, her GPS position, her movement patterns, her cardiac activity, all of it time-stamped, all of it stored. And the question is not whether the watch recorded what happened. The question is what it recorded and whether what it recorded matches the account. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old. She had spent more than 2 decades at AT&T, the kind of career that builds quietly and accumulates into something real. She had a retirement ahead of her. She had a mother named Darlene Hamlet who spoke to her constantly, who knew her finances, who knew her relationship, who had begged her to come home. She was by all accounts a woman who took safety seriously in a way that people noticed. She wore a helmet on the boat when conditions were rough. She wore a safety harness when working on the vessel's exterior. She checked the weather obsessively. She was, according to everyone who knew her, the cautious one. She was the one who was careful. And she was wearing an Apple Watch that logged every heartbeat. That is the person at the center of this. A 55-year-old woman who was careful, who was cautious, who had built something real over decades, and who disappeared from an 8-foot dinghy in the Bahamas on the night of April 4th, 2026, while her husband paddled home alone. Brian Hooker was arrested 4 days later. He has not been charged. The investigation is active, and the Apple Watch has been found. If you have been following this case and you want to know every development the moment it breaks, because there are more coming, and the details we are going to cover today have not been fully examined in most of the coverage, make sure you're subscribed. I post every update as it happens. And what we're about to get into changes the picture of this case significantly. Let's start with what the watch actually is, because this matters enormously for understanding its evidentiary value. An Apple Watch is a wearable computer with multiple sensors running simultaneously and continuously. The optical heart rate sensor takes readings constantly, logging an entry every few minutes under normal conditions and more frequently during detected physical activity. It monitors for irregular cardiac rhythms continuously. The accelerometer detects movement in 3 dimensions, and the watch's motion algorithms automatically classify walking, running, and swimming, each of which produces a distinct signature. Falls produce a specific signature, a rapid acceleration event followed by reduced movement. If the wearer doesn't dismiss the alert within 60 seconds of a detected fall, the watch automatically calls emergency services and notifies the stored emergency contact. Then there's the GPS. On Series 2 and later Apple Watches, the watch has standalone GPS capability. When it's within Bluetooth range of the paired iPhone, it uses the phone's GPS. When it's outside Bluetooth range, if the wearer is separated from their phone, the watch's own GPS antenna activates independently. This is the part that matters most for this case. If Lynette Hooker was separated from the dinghy and from whatever device Brian Hooker was carrying, her Apple Watch continued to record her location on its own. Every position she occupied, every movement she made, all of it time-stamped using a clock that synchronizes with Apple's network time servers whenever the device has connectivity. And if her iCloud account was configured for automatic backup, which is the default configuration, the data synchronized to Apple's servers before the connection was lost is legally accessible through a warrant directed to Apple's legal compliance team. The physical condition of the device doesn't matter. If the data synced before the battery died, it exists on a server, and Apple complies with valid law enforcement requests. The watch is rated to water resistance at 50 meters depth. It can survive submersion without damage to its sensors or storage. So recovering it from a maritime environment does not by itself mean the data is compromised. What it means is that investigators have a device that potentially recorded Lynette Hooker's heart rate, location, and movement throughout the relevant period, and they have that device in their possession. Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, confirmed the watch had been found. A Coast Guard chief told Darlene directly, "Yes, they found the watch. That is confirmed." What is not confirmed, and this is the single most analytically significant gap in the current public record, is where the watch was found. Darlene heard from a friend that it was on the beach, but Darlene herself acknowledged she wasn't certain. She described it as something she learned secondhand. And the distinction between beach, dinghy, and aboard the yacht Soulmate carries completely different implications for the account of what happened. Here is why that matters. If the Apple Watch was found on the beach, the watch was on Lynette's wrist when she reached near shore, or when it separated from her wrist close to shore. That is consistent, on the surface, with Brian's account that he saw her swimming toward land. But it also raises a question with no clean answer. Why did a woman who made it close enough to shore that her watch washed up on a beach not survive? Darlene described Lynette as a strong swimmer. She had been on boats her entire adult life. If the watch was found in the dinghy, and this is the scenario investigators would look at most carefully, it means the watch was not on Lynette's wrist when she went overboard. An Apple Watch band does not come off accidentally. It requires deliberate engagement of a release mechanism. In the water, the band does not loosen. The resistance to accidental removal is a design feature for exactly this kind of use case. A watch found in the dinghy while Lynette was in the water does not have an innocent explanation that is also a simple explanation. That gap, the watch in the boat, the owner in the water, is the kind of physical contradiction that supports probable cause. If the watch was found aboard Soulmate, the larger vessel, it means the watch was not on Lynette's wrist during the dinghy trip at all, which means something about the timeline the account describes is different from what actually happened. Where the watch was found is confirmed. Where specifically it was found is not, and investigators know the answer to that question. Now let's talk about the second device, because the watch they found on Lynette is only half of the digital picture here. Darlene confirmed something that has not received the attention it deserves. Brian Hooker was wearing an Ambit GPS watch during the events of April 4th. Not just any GPS watch. An Ambit is a device specifically designed for endurance athletes and navigators. It records GPS tracks, speed data, altitude, and movement records. And Brian had used it to track and share his sailing course data previously. Darlene confirmed that he had posted segment data from it showing his movements on the water. Bahamian authorities seized electronics from Soulmate. If Brian's Ambit was among what was seized, and it should have been, investigators have a GPS track of every position Brian occupied during the 9-hour window between 7:30 p.m. and approximately 4 a.m., not an approximation. A time-stamped GPS record of every position he was in, every speed he was moving at, every moment he stopped. If that track is consistent with the account he gave, paddling for 7 hours from the overboard location to the point where he made contact with authorities, the account is corroborated by his own device. If that track shows something different from the account, the contradiction is not investigator speculation. It is Brian Hooker's own GPS data, contradicting Brian Hooker's own story. Darlene also confirmed that she had the No Foreign Land tracking app on her phone, which displayed the vessel's position in real time. That independent positional data provides yet another check on the account, a separate timestamp record of where Soulmate was and when. And if you want to follow every piece of digital evidence in this case as investigators work through it, subscribe. This is moving fast, and the developments we haven't covered yet are more significant than what's already been reported. But before we get to what the watch data might or might not establish, we need to talk about what Darlene told us about the financial structure of Brian and Lynette's life together. Because this is not background. This is a documented, verifiable financial condition that changes the analytical context of everything. Lynette Hooker had approximately $600,000 in assets at the time of her disappearance. Darlene estimated this, acknowledging the figure was from a while back and might be different now, but the directionality is established. The assets were primarily from Lynette's AT&T retirement. Brian received no AT&T pension because he was fired from AT&T. When Brian and Lynette first got together, he had 3 children from prior relationships and was paying what Darlene described as an astronomical amount in child support across multiple decades. Lynette picked up the utility bills. She covered the house note. She handled the odds and ends. When the children aged out of child support, both worked at AT&T, and then Brian was fired. The legal fees when Brian was charged in a criminal case involving the alleged choking of his 12-year-old daughter, Lynette paid those. The modifications to Soulmate, the solar panels, the reverse osmosis water system, the equipment that allowed Brian to live off the grid in the way he wanted to live, funded by Lynette's retirement assets. The entire retirement sailing plan, the life they were living, was built on money that was hers. Darlene added one detail that is specific and worth examining carefully. Brian wanted to be off the grid. He did not want anyone to tell him what to do. He did not want anyone to really know where he was. The sailing retirement was not a mutual dream negotiated between partners. It was a specific lifestyle preference that Brian had, and it was funded entirely by someone else's financial resources. A preference for invisibility and financial independence, sustained entirely by a partner who had recently expressed intent to leave. That brings us to March 11th, 24 days before Lynette Hooker disappeared. Lynette called Darlene crying on a specific day. She said she couldn't take it anymore. Brian had been yelling at her, calling her a terrible wife, telling her she was no good for anybody. Darlene asked if he was drinking. Lynette confirmed he was. Darlene asked if he would stop. Lynette told her he had no interest in quitting drinking at all. Darlene's response was direct. Get to Marsh Harbor, get on a plane. I will pick you up at whatever airport you land at. I don't care about your stuff. Come home. The next day, Lynette called back and said they were working on things. And shortly after that conversation, a one-way ticket appeared in the record. March 11th. One way. To come home to Miami. She did not get on the plane. Darlene described the pattern she had seen before. Lynette would leave, would be at her house in Florida, would start looking for a job, and then Brian would call when he wasn't drinking, and Lynette would give him one more chance. 24 days elapsed between the purchase of that ticket and April 4th. What happened in those 24 days, what Brian knew about the ticket's existence, and how that knowledge affected the dynamic aboard a 46-foot yacht in a remote location, those are questions that communication records and the testimony of people Lynette spoke to in that window can potentially answer. What we know is that Lynette had made a decision. She bought a one-way ticket home. And then she didn't use it. And 24 days later, she was in the water. Now we need to talk about what Darlene said Brian told her 18 months before Lynette disappeared. Because this is the detail that reframes everything. 18 months prior to April 4th, 2026, Brian and Lynette were aboard Soulmate. Both had been drinking. According to Darlene, who said Lynette described this to her, Brian threw Lynette down onto the wooden bench in the main cabin. He was on top of her, choking her. She felt something crack in her neck. She was stiff-necked for a long time afterward. She stayed on the boat that night. The next morning, they packed her belongings to take to the dock. Brian helped her carry them, and during the packing, according to Darlene's account of what Lynette told her, Brian said to Lynette, "I wish I had finished the job and thrown her overboard." 18 months before Lynette Hooker went overboard, the person who is the sole adult witness to that event stated explicitly that he wished he had thrown her overboard. That statement was made in the context of a physical altercation on the same vessel. It describes the exact mechanism of what the account of April 4th characterizes as an accidental fall. It is the specific physical outcome, a person going overboard from a vessel, verbally rehearsed by the person whose account of that outcome is under investigation. And it was made directly to the victim. That is not circumstantial background. That is a documented statement of prior expressed intent that directly corresponds to the mechanism of the described event. Whether Bahamian investigators have obtained that statement through Darlene's formal testimony, and whether it has entered the legal framework of the investigation as prior expressed intent, is not confirmed in the public record. But what is confirmed is this. Brian Hooker told Lynette Hooker that he wished he had thrown her overboard. And 18 months later, according to his own account, she went overboard while he was the only other adult present. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He has said he is cooperating with investigators. He denies any wrongdoing. Everything that follows is an examination of the evidence and the hypotheses that evidence generates, not a conclusion about what happened. So let's look at the three frameworks this case is operating inside. The first framework is the complete accident. Lynette and Brian had been drinking all day. Brian confirmed this himself in his initial conversation with Darlene, saying, "We drank all day." They made the decision to take the dinghy out at night in conditions that the search team later described as pitch dark, very windy, and very rough for a small boat. Lynette went overboard. The engine safety lanyard stopped the engine. Brian couldn't retrieve her. He paddled for 7 hours. She was a strong swimmer, but the combination of cold water, rough conditions, darkness, and the cardiovascular stress on a 55-year-old who had been drinking all day was fatal. It was a terrible decision on a terrible night that ended in tragedy. The financial context, the prior statement, the unused ticket, all of it is terrible background that doesn't change the specific event. What this framework requires, an explanation for the lanyard on the passenger who never operated the boat. An explanation for the visibility claim. Brian says he saw her swimming toward shore in pitch dark with no moon. An explanation for the watch's location if it turns out to be in the dinghy rather than on the beach. And an account of what the Apple Watch's heart rate record and GPS track actually show. The second framework is that the account contains errors and gaps, but not criminal intent. Lynette did go overboard, but Brian's account, the visibility claim, the lanyard explanation, the paddling timeline, contains inaccuracies produced by acute stress, distorted memory, and a traumatic night, rather than deliberate deception. He wasn't a strong enough person in that moment to make clear decisions or give a precise account afterward. The prior statement, the financial asymmetry, the ticket, all real, all worth examining, but none of it changes the fact that she went into the water accidentally and he couldn't reach her. What this framework requires, some explanation for why a man who had said he wished he had thrown her overboard would describe an accident so poorly that the account has physical inconsistencies. Stress and trauma produce distorted accounts. But the specific inconsistencies, the visibility claim, the lanyard, are not the kind of errors that trauma alone typically generates. The location of the watch, if it contradicts the account mechanically rather than just imprecisely, changes the framework entirely. The third framework is that the lanyard was not a coincidence and the account was constructed rather than recalled. The prior statement about throwing her overboard was not a figure of speech. The financial context, total dependency on assets that would separate if Lynette followed through on the ticket she bought, created a specific pressure. What the account describes as an accident is something investigators are examining as a possible deliberate act. The Apple Watch data, Brian's GPS data, and the no foreign land tracking records are being analyzed because investigators believe they may show something different from what the account describes. What this framework requires, the watch data. Because the third framework doesn't work without at least one piece of digital evidence that contradicts the account. A prior threat and a financial motive establish context. They do not establish what happened on the water. The watch either corroborates the account or it doesn't. Brian's GPS track either matches the account or it doesn't. The investigation knows what those devices recorded. The public record does not. Brian Hooker told Darlene in their initial conversation after Lynette went missing. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. He mentioned not having a radio. He mentioned something breaking. He said it was all his fault. Whether all his fault is the statement of a man in shock who made terrible decisions that resulted in an accident, or the specific framing of someone who is managing a narrative before investigators arrive, that distinction is exactly what this investigation is trying to establish. And the watch is at the center of it. Here is what the record confirms. The Apple Watch was found. Lynette's phone was likely recovered from Soulmate. Brian's Ambit GPS watch was on his wrist during the 9-hour window and was seized with the other electronics. The No Foreign Land app logged the vessel's position independently. Apple Watch data is retrievable through a warrant regardless of the device's physical condition as long as iCloud backup was enabled. Brian Hooker's account places specific events at specific times in specific locations. Every one of those specific claims is testable against the biological and GPS record that Lynette's watch, Brian's watch, and the vessel tracking data contain. What the record does not confirm, where exactly the Apple Watch was found, what the heart rate log shows, what the GPS track shows, whether Brian's Ambit data has been analyzed and what it revealed, whether the watch's timestamp record is internally consistent with the account Brian gave. The investigation has all of that. The question is what it says. For anyone with information about this case, The Royal Bahamas Police Force at Marsh Harbor Station and the U.S. Coast Guard Criminal Investigations are actively working this. Lynette Hooker has not been found. The investigation is not closed. Here is what I want to ask you directly, and I want you to answer in the comments because I read everyone. The watch was found. Its location, beach, dinghy, or Soulmate, has not been fully confirmed in the public record. In your view, which of those 3 locations is most consistent with the account Brian Hooker gave, and which of them, if confirmed, would change how you understand what happened on the night of April 4th? Because the answer to that question is not the same for all 3 options. Where the watch was found determines what it means, and at least one of those 3 locations has implications that the account cannot absorb. Subscribe to the Obscure Report. This case is active. Brian Hooker has not been charged. Lynette Hooker has not been found. Every development will be covered here the moment it breaks. The watch was recording. The data exists somewhere, and the investigation knows something the public record does not yet contain.